The morning of December 14th, 1941, barely a week after Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder aboard the submarine Seawolf crept into attack position off the southern coast of Mindanao. Through his periscope, he watched a Japanese freighter sitting at anchor, stationary, unescorted, perfect. His crew had waited months for this moment. Everything about the approach was textbook. Range 3,000 yards, sea state calm, target motionless. He ordered the firing solution calculated twice to be certain. Then he gave the command. Fire tubes 1 through 8. 8 Mark 14 torpedoes, each costing over $10,000, each representing months of American industrial production effort, streaked through the Philippine waters toward their target. 7 missed entirely, passing beneath the freighter or running wild. The 8th struck squarely amidships. Seawolf's crew heard the dull clang of metal striking metal through the submarine's hull. Then, nothing. No explosion. The torpedo, its warhead packed with 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, had hit the target directly and refused to detonate. The freighter, suddenly alert, got underway and escaped while Seawolf dove to avoid a depth charge attack that never came because the Japanese vessel carried no anti-submarine weapons. Warder surfaced hours later, steaming away in frustration, having expended 1/3 of his torpedo load without inflicting a scratch. Across the Pacific, in Tokyo, Japanese naval intelligence officers compiled reports on early American submarine operations with barely concealed satisfaction. The Americans, it seemed, couldn't sink a ship if their lives depended on it. Their vaunted submarine force, the largest in the Pacific, was proving to be ineffective beyond contempt. Report after report documented American failures so consistent, so spectacular, that they suggested fundamental flaws in American torpedo design, American submarine training, American naval competence itself. The mathematics were simple. If American submarines couldn't sink Japanese merchant ships when they had perfect shots at stationary targets, then the maritime supply lines connecting Japan's new empire were secure. Resources could be allocated elsewhere. Convoy protection could remain minimal. The merchant fleet could operate with confidence. What Japanese intelligence officers didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly have predicted, was that American failures in 1941 and 1942 were temporary technical problems that American engineering capacity would eventually solve, not permanent indicators of fundamental inferiority. That failure of imagination and assessment would cost Japan 54% of its merchant marine, over 5 million tons of shipping, and ultimately the war itself. The instrument of Japanese economic destruction was already at sea, firing defective torpedoes that would paradoxically lead to the most devastating submarine campaign in naval history. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The pattern of mutual misunderstanding had begun even before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Japanese naval doctrine, refined through decades of study and wargaming, focused almost entirely on decisive fleet battles. The Imperial Japanese Navy had studied the writings of Alfred Thayer Mahan obsessively, absorbing his theories about naval supremacy through concentrated battleship forces. The submarine, in this doctrinal framework, served primarily as a scouting element and occasional attacker of enemy warships, not as a weapon against merchant shipping. Commerce raiding, the systematic destruction of an enemy's merchant fleet, was dismissed as ungentlemanly and strategically irrelevant. Wars were won by sinking battleships and aircraft carriers, not by hunting down freighters and tankers. This belief pervaded Japanese strategic thinking at the highest levels. Before the war, in October 1940, the Imperial Japanese Navy conducted maneuvers to test their defensive capabilities. Submarines were deployed to patrol vital maritime corridors around the home islands, specifically Tsushima Strait between Honshu and Korea, Bungo Strait between Shikoku and Kyushu, and Uraga Strait at the entrance to Tokyo Bay. The submarines simulated attacks on Japanese commercial vessels to determine how vulnerable the merchant fleet might be to submarine raids. In only 5 days, 133 Japanese merchant ships were declared sunk by the submarines. The results were devastating. Japanese anti-submarine capabilities proved inadequate. Convoy escort doctrine barely existed. The merchant fleet was essentially defenseless against a determined submarine campaign. The lesson was clear. Anyone paying attention would have recognized that Japan's island empire, dependent on seaborne supply lines stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific, was extraordinarily vulnerable to submarine warfare. Yet the Navy's response was to dismiss the exercise results as unrealistic. The Japanese convinced themselves that potential enemies, particularly the Americans, would follow the same doctrinal playbook Japan had adopted. Enemy submarines would focus on attacking the battle fleet, not on destroying commerce. The vulnerability revealed by the maneuvers was filed away and largely forgotten. Resources that might have gone to building destroyer escorts, developing effective sonar and depth charges, training anti-submarine warfare crews, instead went to battleships and fleet carriers for the decisive battle Japanese doctrine anticipated. American doctrine before the war had been remarkably similar to Japan's. The United States Navy specified that the main role of submarines was to support the surface fleet by conducting reconnaissance and attacking large enemy warships. But within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, President Franklin Roosevelt made a decision that would eventually strangle the Japanese empire. He authorized unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. Any Japanese ship, military or civilian, in any waters controlled by Japan, could be attacked without warning and without aid to survivors. It was total war beneath the waves, and it represented a fundamental shift in American naval strategy. The problem was that American submarines in December 1941 were utterly incapable of executing this mission, not because of a lack of courage or training, but because their primary weapon was catastrophically defective. The Mark 14 torpedo, designed during the Great Depression when testing budgets were almost non-existent, suffered from 3 separate catastrophic defects that masked each other and made diagnosis extraordinarily difficult. Understanding how these defects poisoned American submarine operations for nearly 2 years requires understanding how the torpedo was designed, or rather, how it wasn't properly tested. The Mark 14 was designed starting in 1931 to equip the new fleet submarines then under construction. The design specifications were ambitious. The torpedo would be 20 feet 6 inches long, weigh 3,000 pounds, carry a 643-pound Torpex warhead, and achieve ranges of 4,500 yards at 46 knots. It would be guided by a sophisticated gyroscope system and run at a precise depth controlled by a hydrostatic mechanism. Most ambitiously, it would be equipped with the Mark 6 exploder, a magnetic influence device that would detonate the torpedo beneath the keel of enemy ships, breaking their backs and ensuring kills. The Mark 6 represented cutting-edge technology for its era. Instead of requiring a direct hit on the target's hull, it would detect changes in Earth's magnetic field caused by a ship's steel hull passing overhead. When these magnetic changes reached a certain threshold, the exploder would fire, detonating beneath the target where the explosion would be most effective. The theory was brilliant. The execution was disastrous. The problem was testing. A Mark 14 torpedo in 1931 cost over $10,000, equivalent to roughly $200,000 in current purchasing power. In the depths of the Great Depression, with naval budgets slashed and Congress scrutinizing every expenditure, the Navy was extraordinarily reluctant to spend money destroying expensive torpedoes in live fire tests. Instead, the Mark 14 was tested using exercise heads, dummy warheads filled with water that could be recovered after test firings. These exercise heads approximated the weight of the combat warhead, but had different weight distribution. This difference affected the torpedo's trim and hydrodynamic characteristics in ways that wouldn't become apparent until combat use. More critically, no live fire tests were conducted against actual target ships to verify that the exploder would function under combat conditions. The Mark 6 magnetic exploder was so secret that submarine commanders weren't allowed to examine it or understand how it worked. The entire system was accepted for combat use based on mathematical calculations, laboratory tests, and exercise firings that never duplicated actual combat conditions. The first defect was depth control. The torpedo ran 10 to 11 feet deeper than its set depth, because the depth mechanism had never been properly tested with the heavier combat warhead. When engineers increased the warhead weight during final development, adding 80 pounds of additional explosive, they failed to recalibrate the hydrostatic depth sensor. Additionally, this sensor was poorly positioned on the torpedo's body, where water flow created pressure variations. As the torpedo accelerated to combat speed, water flowing over the hull created a pressure drop at the sensor location through Bernoulli's principle. The depth mechanism, detecting this pressure drop, interpreted it as the torpedo being too shallow and responded by driving the torpedo deeper. Every Mark 14 fired in combat in 1941 and 1942 ran far beneath its intended depth. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet depth actually ran at 20 to 25 feet depth, passing harmlessly beneath targets. The second defect was the magnetic exploder itself. The Mark 6 had been tested near the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, where the magnetic field strength and orientation were suitable for its operation. In the Pacific, operating near Java, the Philippines, Guadalcanal, and Japan itself, magnetic field characteristics were entirely different. Some torpedoes exploded prematurely, detonating 50 or 100 yards before reaching their targets. These premature detonations did minimal damage, merely alerting targets that they were under attack. Other torpedoes passed beneath targets and failed to explode at all because the magnetic field changes weren't sufficient to trigger the exploder in the actual operating environment. The third defect, hidden beneath the first two, was in the contact exploder mechanism itself. The Mark 6 incorporated both magnetic and contact firing systems in a single unit. The contact system used a firing pin design that worked reliably in older, slower torpedoes. But when a torpedo traveling at 46 knots strikes a steel hull, the deceleration is nearly instantaneous and extraordinarily violent. The firing pin in the Mark 6 was relatively heavy, and at high impact velocity, particularly on 90-degree angle hits, the sudden deceleration caused the firing pin to bind in its housing before it could strike the detonator cap. Perfect shots, direct perpendicular hits exactly as submarine commanders were trained to shoot, were most likely to be duds. Only oblique angle hits allowed the firing pin to function properly. This defect had actually been discovered and corrected in older torpedo models back in 1922. But when the Mark 6 was designed, the earlier lesson was apparently forgotten. Japanese merchant ships began arriving in port with American torpedoes, lodged exploded in their hulls. The ultimate humiliation for American submarine crews who had executed perfect attacks. On Christmas Eve 1941, Commander Tyrrell Jacobs aboard Sargo encountered 4 Japanese cargo ships off the coast of Indochina. The ships were steaming in loose convoy without escort. Jacobs maneuvered into textbook attack positions and fired 3 torpedoes at each of 4 targets, 12 torpedoes total, from ranges between 1,000 and 2,000 yards. Conditions were perfect. Sea calm, visibility excellent, targets making steady courses. Every torpedo either missed entirely or malfunctioned, not a single explosion. Jacobs watched through his periscope as torpedo after torpedo passed beneath targets or struck and failed to explode or exploded prematurely without causing damage. He fired his final 4 torpedoes at a large cargo ship that had actually stopped and was lowering boats to investigate what was happening. All 4 torpedoes ran beneath the stationary target. Sargo returned to Manila Bay on December 30th with her crew demoralized, having expended all 24 torpedoes aboard without sinking a single ship. Jacobs filed a scathing after-action report, stating unequivocally that his torpedoes were running far deeper than their set depths. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, responsible for torpedo development and production, dismissed his complaints with barely concealed contempt. The problem, Bureau officers insisted, lay with submarine commanders who didn't understand proper torpedo maintenance, with crews who weren't performing correct pre-launch procedures, with captains who couldn't execute proper attack approaches. The Mark 14 was the most sophisticated, most thoroughly tested weapon in the American arsenal. Any failures were due to operator error, not design flaws. This position would be maintained with bureaucratic obstinacy for nearly 2 years, while American submarines fired thousands of defective torpedoes and Japanese merchant ships steamed safely to port. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American submarine radio traffic, partially decrypting American operational messages, and interrogating crews from captured submarines compiled detailed reports on American torpedo failures. These reports reached Imperial Naval General Headquarters in Tokyo by early 1942. The assessment was clear. American torpedoes were primitive weapons plagued by fundamental design flaws. American submariners were poorly trained and lacked the aggressive spirit necessary for effective combat operations. American industrial capacity was producing weapons that didn't work, ships that were inferior to Japanese vessels, equipment that broke down under combat conditions. This assessment, based on accurate observation of American failures but fundamentally wrong in its interpretation, would prove catastrophic. Throughout 1942, the pattern repeated itself with numbing regularity. American submarines stalked targets, maneuvered into attack positions, fired torpedoes that should have guaranteed kills, and achieved nothing. The statistics told a devastating story. In 1942, American submarines in the Pacific fired 1,442 torpedoes at Japanese targets. Post-war analysis of Japanese records revealed the true figures. American submarines sank 109 ships, totaling 418,000 tons, barely 3% of the tonnage they thought they'd destroyed. Submarine commanders filed report after furious report documenting torpedoes that ran too deep, exploded prematurely, struck targets directly, and refused to detonate. Japanese merchant captains began reporting American torpedoes lodged unexploded in their hulls. The torpedoes were carefully removed by Japanese ordnance personnel, who examined them with professional interest and growing confidence. These reports reinforced Japanese belief that the American submarine threat was manageable. Convoy protection resources could be allocated elsewhere. The merchant fleet could operate with minimal escort. Resources that might have gone to building escort vessels, developing effective sonar and radar, training anti-submarine warfare crews, instead went to fleet carriers for the decisive battle Japanese naval doctrine anticipated. The confidence shaped strategic decisions. As of December 8, 1941, Japan had no unit whose exclusive mission was protecting merchant ships. Such protection was concurrently carried out by forces engaging in sea patrol. No convoys were organized for non-military shipping. Civil-controlled ships were encouraged to sail independently. This approach, which made sense when submarines were believed ineffective, would prove suicidal once American torpedoes began working properly. It was not until the fall of 1942 that Japan even issued unified regulations for merchant ship protection, and not until November 1943 that the Grand Escort Fleet Headquarters was created to coordinate convoys. By then, it was far too late. The truth was that the Mark 14 torpedo could be fixed. The problems were technical, not fundamental. American engineering capacity, American industrial might, American determination to solve problems through systematic investigation would eventually identify and correct every defect. The question was how long it would take and how many opportunities would be lost while submarines fired weapons that didn't work. The depth control problem was identified first. By mid-1942, enough. Submarine commanders had reported similar problems that the Bureau of Ordnance could no longer dismiss them all as operator error. Tests were finally conducted with actual combat warheads, and the depth control defect was confirmed. Torpedoes were now set to run shallower to compensate, though this wasn't a complete solution. The magnetic exploder problem proved more difficult. Some submarine commanders, frustrated by premature detonations, began deactivating the magnetic feature against orders. This helped but revealed the contact exploder's own defect. The breaking point came in July 1943. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit aboard Tinosa spotted the whale factory ship Tonan Maru No. 3 alone and unescorted south of Truk. The ship was enormous, 19,250 tons, slow, defenseless, carrying critical whale oil for Japanese industry. Darspit fired 15 torpedoes at this perfect target under ideal conditions. 13 hit and failed to explode. He kept his last torpedo unfired for analysis and cleared the area. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet, recognized that Darspit's experience represented a controlled experiment. He ordered immediate testing. His staff constructed a testing range where dummy warheads were dropped from a pier crane onto steel plates at various angles. The tests revealed the firing pin mechanism jammed at high impact velocities. The solution came from examining Japanese aircraft shot down during the Pearl Harbor attack. Engineers discovered that Japanese propeller blades were made from lightweight aluminum alloy. If the firing pin were made from aluminum instead of steel, it would have less inertia during deceleration. Tests confirmed the theory. By September 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, modified torpedoes with aluminum firing pins began reaching submarines. The transformation in American submarine effectiveness after September 1943 represented one of the most dramatic capability shifts in naval warfare history. Submarine commanders who had learned their trade in the school of hard experience, who had survived 2 years of combat despite defective weapons, now possessed torpedoes that actually worked. The effect on Japanese shipping was immediate and catastrophic. The submarine Flasher, commanded by Commander Reuben Whittaker, intercepted a convoy off Indochina on December 22, 1944. Whittaker maneuvered into attack position and fired 6 torpedoes at 3 tankers. All 6 functioned perfectly. 3 tankers, the 10,000-ton Omarosan Maru, the 9,200-ton Arita Maru, and the 9,200-ton Otorisan Maru, carrying critical fuel oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, went to the bottom in less than 20 minutes. In a single attack, Whittaker had sunk over 28,000 tons of shipping and sent hundreds of thousands of gallons of irreplaceable fuel to the ocean floor. The submarine Tang, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, achieved even more spectacular results. O'Kane had served as executive officer aboard Wahoo, one of the most aggressive submarines in the Pacific, before taking command of Tang in October 1943. On her third war patrol in June and July 1944, Tang sank 10 ships, totaling 39,160 tons. On June 24 alone, off the coast of Japan, Tang destroyed 4 ships in a single day. The attack was executed with surgical precision. O'Kane identified a convoy of 6 large ships guarded by 16 escorts. Most submarine commanders would have avoided such a heavily defended target. O'Kane surfaced and attacked at night, firing spreads of torpedoes that struck multiple targets. When the smoke cleared, 4 passenger cargo ships and freighters, Tamahoko Maru, Tainan Maru, Nasusan Maru, and Kenichi Maru, totaling 16,292 tons, had been destroyed. These were not lucky hits or random successes. These were precisely executed attacks using weapons that now worked as designed, delivered by submarine commanders who had learned through bitter experience exactly how to employ them to maximum effect. The statistics documented the transformation. In 1942, American submarines fired 1,442 torpedoes and sank 109 ships for 418,700 tons. In 1943, as torpedo problems were gradually corrected, submarines fired 3,937 torpedoes and sank 284 ships for 1,349,000 tons. In 1944, with fully functional torpedoes, submarines fired 6,902 torpedoes and sank 492 ships for 2,388,000 tons. The effectiveness improvement was roughly tenfold once the torpedoes began functioning properly. Japanese naval planners observing early American submarine operations through 1942 and early 1943 had concluded that the submarine threat was manageable. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong once American torpedoes began working reliably. The convoy system Japan finally implemented in late 1943 came too late and remained inadequate. Japanese destroyers formed the bulk of convoy protection. These ships had impressive night fighting capabilities, having been designed primarily for surface combat and torpedo attacks against enemy warships. But they had significant deficiencies in sonar and radar compared to British and American escort vessels. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine emphasized protecting naval task forces rather than merchant convoys. More critically, Japan never successfully developed cost-effective destroyer escorts better suited for convoy duties. The escort destroyers and frigates that were finally built, 32 escort destroyers launched between 1944 and 1945, arrived far too late to make any strategic difference. By the time these vessels entered service, the American submarine campaign had already achieved decisive results. Japanese merchant capacity was declining inexorably toward zero, regardless of anything the escort force could accomplish. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of the submarine campaign remains difficult to quantify precisely, but was certainly devastating. American submarines operating under unrestricted warfare orders targeted any Japanese vessel in the Pacific. Merchant ships, tankers, troop transports, even hospital ships misidentified in the chaos of war were attacked without warning. Japanese merchant sailors died by the thousands, trapped below decks as torpedoes blasted holes in hulls, drowning in oil-filled waters, burned alive when tankers exploded, dying of exposure in lifeboats that drifted for weeks without rescue. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained no effective rescue service for merchant sailors. They were viewed as expendable civilian personnel rather than critical national resources whose survival should be prioritized. Many American submarine commanders, operating under orders that technically prohibited aid to survivors but retaining human compassion, surfaced after attacks to offer survivors water, food, and directions to the nearest land. Japanese military personnel, indoctrinated to view Americans as barbaric enemies, often refused assistance, swimming away from rescue rather than accepting help from men they had been taught were less than human. The toll on Japan's military was even more catastrophic than losses among merchant sailors. American submarines didn't just sink cargo ships and tankers, they sank troop transports carrying reinforcements to island garrisons. The numbers are staggering and have only recently been fully documented. American submarines killed at least 97,342 Japanese soldiers during the war, more than the Marine Corps and Army killed in the Central Pacific Drive from Tarawa in November 1943 to Iwo Jima in February and March 1945. In May 1944, the submarine Pollock intercepted the troopship Bangkok Maru carrying the 1,559-man 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force to Tarawa. The force was well-trained and equipped, among the elite of Japanese naval infantry. Pollock fired effective torpedoes and sank Bangkok Maru in about 90 seconds. The ship went down so quickly that most of the force was trapped below decks. Only a handful survived. An entire elite unit, irreplaceable at that stage of the war, vanished in less than 2 minutes. By 1944, Japan's strategic situation had become desperate. The Imperial Army, previously focused on fighting on the Asian continent, finally pivoted to defend the Pacific theater. This required massive movements of troops by sea, exactly when American submarines had become devastatingly effective. With oceans now packed with Japanese troopships, American submarines inflicted a calamity on the Imperial Army. In 1944 alone, submarines killed approximately 79,000 Japanese soldiers aboard sinking transports. The Take-Ichi convoy in April and May 1944 illustrated the transformation in American submarine effectiveness and Japanese vulnerability. The convoy was assembled to carry the 32nd Division to Mindanao and the main body of the 35th Division to Western New Guinea. Both divisions were veterans of fighting in China, experienced formations that Japan desperately needed to defend critical island positions. American signals intelligence operators detected the convoy's departure through code-breaking operations. The convoy's route, speed, daily noon positions, and destination were all known to American commanders through decrypted Japanese messages. Submarines were positioned to ambush the Japanese ships. On April 26, USS Jack attacked, sinking one transport with nearly 1,000 troops aboard. On May 6, additional submarines intercepted the convoy. USS Gurnard sank the transport Yoshida Maru No. 1 with 1,500 troops. USS Flasher destroyed another transport. By the time the convoy reached its destination, 4 transports had been sunk, killing more than 4,000 soldiers. The survivors, their equipment lost, their combat power blunted by casualties, contributed little to Japan's defensive efforts. The convoy's destruction had important strategic results, contributing to Imperial Headquarters' decision to move Japan's defensive perimeter back by 1,000 kilometers. The economic consequences of the submarine campaign rippled through every aspect of Japan's war effort. Japan was an island nation utterly dependent on seaborne logistics. Raw materials from conquered territories in Southeast Asia, China, and the Dutch East Indies had to be shipped to Japan for processing. Finished military equipment had to be shipped from Japan to forward bases and combat zones. Food imports were essential to feed the population. Oil from the Dutch East Indies was critical to every aspect of the war economy and military operations. By January 1945, the Japanese merchant fleet had been reduced to barely a quarter of its December 1941 strength. Japanese shipping losses in 1942 totaled 977,927 tons, an average of roughly 81,500 tons per month. In 1943, the number nearly doubled to 1,767,642 tons. In 1944, losses more than doubled again, totaling 3,823,485 tons. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Japanese merchant capacity was declining toward zero regardless of anything Japan's navy or army could accomplish on the battlefield. Tankers carrying oil from the East Indies were being sunk faster than they could complete round trips. Cargo ships bringing raw materials were going to the bottom with their holds full. Food imports had declined to the point that rationing in Japan approached starvation levels. The industrial consequences cascaded through Japan's entire war economy. Oil refineries on the home islands shut down for lack of crude. Japan's petroleum production, never sufficient for military needs even with imports, collapsed to negligible levels. Steel mills closed for lack of iron ore and coking coal. Aircraft factories stopped producing for lack of aluminum, which had to be imported since Japan had virtually no domestic aluminum production. Training programs for pilots and sailors ground to a halt for lack of fuel. Naval vessels sat pierside or swung at anchor because there was no oil for their engines. The combined fleet, once the third largest navy in the world, a force that had defeated the Russian Navy at Tsushima and dominated the Western Pacific in 1942, was reduced to immobility by lack of fuel. When the super battleship Yamato sortied in April 1945 for a suicide attack on American forces at Okinawa, she carried fuel for only a one-way voyage. She was sunk by carrier aircraft without ever reaching her target, going down with 2,498 of her crew. Army divisions in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands withered from lack of supplies and reinforcements. Ammunition, replacement weapons, medical supplies, food, all had to be shipped from Japan. Increasingly, those ships never arrived. Troops on isolated garrisons went months without resupply, as submarines sank the freighters that were their lifeline. Battle casualties couldn't be replaced, as troop ships carrying reinforcements were torpedoed and sunk. The home islands faced potential starvation as food imports ceased. Japan had never been self-sufficient in food production, relying on imports from Korea, Formosa, and Southeast Asia. By 1945, those imports had been reduced to a trickle. Urban populations in Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya faced increasing hunger as rice rations were cut repeatedly. Black markets flourished as desperate civilians paid exorbitant prices for food. The government implemented draconian measures to maintain control, but the simple reality was that Japan couldn't feed its population without imports, and submarines had cut those imports to unsustainable levels. American strategic bombing, which received enormous attention in popular accounts and post-war assessments, was actually secondary to the submarine blockade in destroying Japan's ability to wage war. The Army Air Force's firebombing campaign against Japanese cities, while devastating to civilian populations and psychologically traumatic, had limited immediate impact on Japan's war economy because that economy had already been crippled by lack of raw materials. Factories couldn't operate without steel, aluminum, coal, and oil, regardless of whether they were being bombed. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, provided the Japanese government with a face-saving reason to surrender. But Japan was already defeated economically and militarily by that point. The nation simply couldn't continue fighting regardless of battlefield outcomes, because the economic foundation of its war effort had been destroyed by submarines. The final irony involves Japanese intelligence's initial assessment of American submarine capabilities. In 1942, observing American torpedo failures and ineffective attacks, Japanese analysts had concluded that American submarines posed a manageable threat. This assessment shaped resource allocation decisions that proved fatal. Resources went to battleships and carriers for the decisive fleet battle Japanese doctrine anticipated, not to escort vessels and anti-submarine warfare. When American engineers systematically identified and fixed every torpedo defect, Japanese intelligence agencies were slow to recognize the transformation and even slower to convince operational commanders to adjust strategy accordingly. By the time Japanese naval planners understood the true magnitude of the submarine threat, it was too late. The ships had already been sunk, the merchant marine had been destroyed. The economy had been strangled beyond recovery. The Grand Escort Fleet Headquarters, created in November 1943 to coordinate convoy protection, received inadequate resources and faced an impossible task. By 1944, American submarines were operating with reliable torpedoes, sophisticated intelligence from code breaking, radar that allowed night surface attacks, and aggressive commanders who had learned their trade through years of combat experience. Japanese anti-submarine forces, despite improvements, remained inferior to American capabilities. Japanese radar lagged behind American technology. Depth charges, even after Congressman Andrew May's unfortunate revelation in 1943 that Japanese depth charges were set too shallow, remained less effective than American weapons. Sonar systems on Japanese escorts were adequate but not exceptional. Training for anti-submarine warfare had been neglected for years in favor of surface combat doctrine. The statistics tell the final story. By the end of the war in August 1945, American submarines had sunk 1,113 Japanese merchant vessels totaling 4,779,902 tons, representing 54.6% of all Japanese merchant shipping losses. More critically, they had sunk 201 naval vessels, including the aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest carrier ever built at 72,000 tons displacement, and the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The toll included 1 battleship, 8 carriers, 11 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers and smaller vessels. The human cost was staggering. At least 97,342 Japanese soldiers died aboard sinking transports. Merchant sailor casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. The economic destruction was total. Japan's merchant fleet, which had numbered over 6 million tons in December 1941, had been reduced to less than 1.5 million tons by August 1945. The ships that survived did so by hiding in ports, not daring to venture into waters patrolled by American submarines. The American submarine service paid its own price for this victory. Of 288 submarines that served in World War II, 52 were lost, 48 to enemy action, and 4 to accidents. 3,505 submariners died, representing 22% of the force, the highest casualty rate of any American combat arm. These men volunteered for submarine duty knowing the risks. They operated in steel cylinders beneath the ocean, vulnerable to depth charges, mines, aircraft attack, and mechanical failure. When submarines were hit, escape was often impossible. Crews drowned as compartments flooded or suffocated as air systems failed. They died knowing that their families might never learn what happened, that their boats might simply disappear without explanation. But they continued fighting because the mission was clear and the results were measurable. Every Japanese merchant ship sunk was one less cargo of oil reaching Japan. Every troop transport destroyed was one less division reinforcing island garrisons. Every tanker sent to the bottom was hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel denied to Japanese aircraft and warships. The cumulative effect was the strangulation of an island empire that required seaborne logistics to survive. Victory in the Pacific War was determined not by the spectacular carrier battles at Midway and the Philippine Sea that captured imaginations and dominated headlines, but by the grinding attrition of submarine warfare that destroyed Japan's ability to sustain combat operations. The weapon Japanese intelligence had dismissed as ineffective in 1942 became the instrument of Japanese economic collapse, proving that in warfare, dismissing enemy capabilities based on early failures is a mistake nations make at their mortal peril. The American submarine campaign represented industrial warfare at its most ruthless and effective. It demonstrated that numerical superiority, logistical capacity, and engineering capability can overcome initial technical failures to produce victory through sheer relentless pressure that the enemy cannot match or counter. Japan's empire sank not in glorious decisive battle, but in the cold mathematics of tonnage lost versus tonnage built, a calculation where American industrial might and Japanese doctrinal rigidity combined to produce inevitable defeat. Japanese intelligence failed to understand that American failures in 1942 were temporary technical problems that American engineering capacity would solve, not permanent indicators of fundamental inferiority. That failure of imagination and assessment cost Japan 54% of its merchant marine, millions of tons of critical supplies, hundreds of thousands of military and civilian lives, and ultimately the war itself. The submarines that Japanese analysts had dismissed, operating with torpedoes that finally worked as designed, strangled an empire and demonstrated that wars are won not just by tactical brilliance or operational excellence, but by the grinding economic realities of industrial capacity, resource availability, and the ability to learn from failures and implement solutions. The morning of December 14th, 1941, Frederick Warder aboard Seawolf had fired 8 torpedoes at a stationary target and achieved nothing. By December 14th, 1944, exactly 3 years later, American submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The transformation took 21 months of frustration, thousands of defective torpedoes, and systematic engineering investigation that identified and corrected every flaw. But once achieved, that transformation produced the most devastating submarine campaign in naval history and strangled the Japanese empire beneath the waves. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.